I was 7, I decided that I and I alone was going to solve the issue of world peace. When I told my family and friends, they started laughing hysterically and tried to explain over and over again that this undertaking was impossible. But if anything, that made me want to do it even more. So I pushed their dissenting opinions aside and got to work. My very well thought out plan consisted of driving my mom's minivan to some unnamed country in Africa and picking up a family there. And that was it. That was how I was going to solve world peace. See, yeah, you're laughing, and I really wish I was laughing at that time, but the only thing going through 7-year-old Jane's head was, why hadn't anyone thought of this sooner? I was so excited, and that night, when I went to bed, I closed my eyes and imagined how the scenario would play out in my head. I arrived to where the family was and realized very quickly that I didn't really bring anything with me, and the family would probably want some food. So I scratched that and started over. Scenario 2. I arrived to where the family was with my van full of food and realized that the family could probably use some new clothes. Scenario 3. I arrived to where the family was with my van full of food and clothes and realized that they needed medical care. They needed a place to sleep, a place to shower, a place to live. Scenario 527. I arrived to where the family was with my van so full of stuff you could barely shut the trunk. And when I opened the door, the family wanted to bring their friends with them. And I didn't have enough room in my 6-passenger van. My van, still in Africa, but now full of stuff, kept getting bigger and bigger, and by scenario 624, I had invented the first ever mobile hospital/hotel. I called it the Wheelie Hospital, fully equipped with anything you could possibly need to survive the day. It was perfect. But as the scenario continued, I started to ask the question, where would this hospital end up? Scenario 653, how was I going to get a skyscraper on wheels? Scenario 712, where was I going to get all of the materials? Scenario 1482, my parents were right. The issue of world peace was a lot more complicated than 7-year-old Jane thought. So were the issues of world poverty, world hunger, terrorism. So are the issues of the death penalty, abortion, gun control, climate change, COVID. Each and every one of these issues is so full of nuance and complexities. There are so many factors to consider, so many details to account for. 7-year-old Jane was nowhere near solving world peace. I want to make that very clear. But I tell that story because I so distinctly remember sitting in my room thinking about every possible problem that could occur when I arrived to where the family was. And as I grew up, I was so confused as why people were so quick to split issues in two. Right or wrong, yes or no. For example, let's take a look at the issue of prohibition. In 1920, Congress passed the 18th Amendment prohibiting the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. During this time, alcohol had seemingly corrupted and taken over the ideal American family. Men would rush to the bars after work, taking time away from their wife and children, and show up to work the next day unable to function, which severely decreased productivity in the workforce. This new amendment seemed like the perfect solution. Scenario 1. But on the other hand, these men had just arrived home from an ugly, horrific war and were thrown into a society that was now unfamiliar to them. They turned to alcohol to escape their trauma because of how little was known about mental health and PTSD at the time. With these factors considered, alcohol seemed like the best solution. In addition, what would the consequences for this law be? How would this law be enforced? What other consequences would ensue if alcohol was either banned or allowed? That last question needed to be talked about and addressed, but it didn't even get asked because people were so caught up in the fight. People were so consumed by the fact that there was an argument that they completely looked past the people they were trying to help in the first place. They jumped to form two sides, right or wrong, yes or no. They drew their weapons, closed their fists, and left the people they were trying to help worse off than when they started. But that was over 100 years ago. What about today? Well, in 2020, former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden took the stage for debate before the presidential election happening later that year. Journalist Matthew Walker described the event as 96 minutes of shouts, insults, interruptions, stray thoughts, and loose babble. And he wasn't very far off. The two men auditioning to be the leaders of our country spent over an hour and a half calling each other names like kindergartners. There was barely any discussion of politics, extremely limited conversation of issues, just destructive banter about each other's personal characteristics. And this debate certainly wasn't an isolated incident. If anything, it was a televised demonstration of what we do every single day on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, interactions with relatives, banter with classmates. We are in a war that we started because we chose to attack people because they took a stance on an issue that is full of nuance and complexity that no one took the time to understand. Every single day, we fail at the things we were taught in kindergarten, from being kind to others to basic respect for human beings. We see issues as good or bad, right or wrong. We see people as good or bad, right or wrong. Author Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, if there were a group of purely evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were only necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. It would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? Two distinct categories, everything split down the middle. But our world is so much more complex than that. So how do we fix this? How do we bridge this enormous gap that we've created over years and years of fighting? How do we end this war we've created? Well, while sitting in my basement pondering the answers to these questions, I kept hearing my kindergarten teacher's voice in my head. Mrs. Massey, one of my greatest childhood role models, taught us that the first step to ending conflict of any kind is to love. She taught me that no one is purely evil, that people deserve second chances, and that above all, it is more important to be loving than to be right. And I know those statements are rather abstract ideas, so I've boiled them down into 5 tangible things that we can all do every single day to fix what we broke. Number 1, have the conversation. Not just any conversation, but the conversation, the one that you're scared to have, the one about the scary issues that make people afraid. Those are the conversations that need to take place if we want to get anywhere. And during that conversation, listen. Really listening to someone is incredibly hard. A Forbes magazine article stated that 85% of what we know was learned from listening, yet only 25% of what we hear every day we actually recall. This is because we are so quick to listen to respond, to come up with the perfect comeback, when what we need to do is listen to understand. 3, impact versus intent. While this might seem like an attack, just because you meant something a certain way doesn't mean that that person took it like that. The impact of your actions or words means so much than how you intended them. And if you offended this person, you owe them an apology. You owe to take a step back and think about what you just said or what you just did and how that person might react. Number 4, acknowledge the nuance. I've talked about this over and over again, but it is time that we stop throwing people into categories and stereotypes and start looking at the individual human being and their own distinct story. And when all of those things are being done, we'll find that we can find common ground. And this might seem impossible, seeming how polarized our country is right now. But there are so many things that we have in common, so many statements that we can agree on. We just have to take that first step to identify them. And while many of you might disagree, and it's okay to disagree, I believe that these issues are worth talking about. I believe that these conversations are worth having. And I believe that this is the first step to making the broken world we live in whole. Thank you.